Hi guys, and welcome to our lecture for Chapter 13, How Safe is Our Food Supply? Keeping food safe. So first we're going to go over a few definitions related to food poisoning. First we have foodborne illness. This is specifically an illness caused by the consumption of contaminated food. The foodborne illness usually causes gastrointestinal symptoms, including abdominal pain, nausea, diarrhea, and vomiting. It can also cause kidney failure, arthritis, paralysis, miscarriage for pregnant women, and in the most serious cases, death. Foodborne illness is usually caused by microbes, which is another word for microorganisms. Microbes include bacteria, viruses, fungi, or parasites. Now, not all microbes are harmful, but those that do have the ability to cause disease are called pathogens. When it comes to food poisoning, the symptoms and severity of the illness depends on the potency of the contaminant, so how much of the contaminant is present in the food, how much of that food is consumed, how often that food was consumed. For the individual contracting the foodborne illness, it's important to consider their age, body size, nutritional status, and any currently occurring chronic diseases. We have to consider the absorption, metabolism, and storage of the contaminant in the body, and also an individual's immune function, which means those individuals who are most at risk include young children, the elderly, pregnant women, people with AIDS or on chemotherapy, or those using immunosuppressant drugs. We have many different agencies, both here in the United States and around the world, that work to monitor our food supply. We're going to talk about these a little bit more in depth on upcoming slides, but I wanted to make sure just to mention them here. I'm not going to go through the longer descriptions, but this table is table 13.1 in your text if you'd like to read through it further. So we have two international organizations listed here that are tasked with monitoring our food supply. First, we have the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, or FAO. Then, one you've probably heard of, the World Health Organization, or WHO. When it comes to federal organizations here in the United States, we rely on the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, or USDA, and their Division of Food Safety and Inspection Service, the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, National Marine Fisheries Service, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, and finally the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC. There are numerous state and local government agencies, but because they differ from state to state, we're not really going to take a lot of time specifically discussing them today. So the role of government when it comes to food safety is to set standards and establish regulations. This includes safe handling of food and water and also the information that's included on food labels. The government also regulates the use of additives, packaging materials, and agricultural chemicals, inspects food processing and storage facilities, monitors domestic and imported foods, and investigates outbreak of foodborne illness. Some recent federal changes concerning food safety include the National Food Safety Initiative, the goal of which is to reduce foodborne illness by improving U.S. food safety practices and policies, and this was created with food safety for farm to table in mind. Another recent federal change is the FDA Food Safety Modernization Act, focuses on preventing foodborne illness. It was passed in 2011 in response to the continued threat from our food supply, and it gave the FDA an inspection mandate and new legal powers. Keeping food safe from farm to table. Now this graphic comes right from your text. I'm not going to read all the little boxes, but it's important to think about as we continue our discussion of food safety. So at the top, in the top box, we have a picture of food growing on a farm in the ground. And so that's the very first place where we see food in our food system. So the origin of that food at a farm is one place where food safety concerns are very important, whether that's the safety of the water supply, the soil, are there any pesticides that are used on those plants? All very important. The next step when the food leaves the farm is processing, and that's in the second picture below. So in the processing facility, are foods stored at the appropriate temperatures? Is the equipment that's used for processing free of defects and contamination? So another place where food safety can be an issue. The third box, all the way on the bottom, we see a truck. It looks like this truck in particular might be a dairy truck. So transportation, when food is moving from the processing center to the grocery store, is it kept at the appropriate temperature in a refrigerated truck? Is it exposed to air, sunlight, other things that could alter the quality of that food? Then once it's transported, it arrives at the retail location, at the grocery store. Food can certainly become contaminated during handling or storage at grocery stores. So it's something that a lot of grocery stores pay a lot of close attention to because they certainly don't want contamination occurring at their end. And then after you purchase the food and bring it home, even if it's safe up until this point, there's still the potential for food safety issues at home, particularly during storage and preparation, and with the issue of cross-contamination, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. When it comes to food safety, oftentimes at each step in that process, whether it's at the farm, processing, transportation, they often use a plan known as HACCP, and HACCP stands for Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Point. So the food safety system requires this system for food manufacturers, processors, and distributors. It analyzes food production, processing, and transport, and the goal of a HACCP plan is to identify potential sources of contamination and points where measures can be taken to prevent contamination. This includes ongoing monitoring of those critical control points. So this is an example. In this case, we have eggs. So first, a facility would conduct a hazard analysis and say, okay, we have these eggs for X number of days. While they're here, while they're under our roof, where are some places that things could go wrong? With eggs, the biggest issue is a salmonella contamination, and so adequate processing in terms of heating is a preventive measure that can eliminate that hazard. So then identifying the critical control points. Okay, so we're going to heat up the eggs to make sure that they're not contaminated with salmonella. The critical control points would be how high that temperature needs to be in order to eliminate the hazard of salmonella contamination. So that temperature would be a critical control point. And then critical limits would be the parameters that will prevent the hazard. So, okay, the eggs have to be heated to a certain temperature, but for how long do they have to be held at that temperature? So that would be a critical limit, would be that period of time. The next step would be to monitor the critical control points. So if you say the eggs need to be heated to 150 degrees, well, there has to be ongoing monitoring of those, of the machinery that's responsible for heating the eggs to make sure that, yes, it is staying up to temperature. Yes, it is holding that temperature long enough. So you have to have ongoing monitoring to make sure that everything is going the way that it's supposed to. Step 5 is establishing corrective action. Okay, so everything's going great. That's awesome. But what happens if something goes wrong? You have to prepare for that and already have a corrective action in place so that if something goes wrong, you know what steps to take. So, for example, if you're monitoring the critical control points, you're checking that temperature and you realize that the temperature isn't high enough or that the temperature is too high and the product is ruined, the corrective action would be to properly dispose of the entire batch of that product that was affected. Number 6 is maintaining record keeping procedures. So if you're checking the temperature every couple of hours, you have to continue to record that temperature, what time it was taken, who took the temperature, and keep an ongoing record over a long period of time so that if anyone were to get sick later on from consuming that product, if one of those federal organizations comes to talk to you as the processor, you can look back at your records and say, nope, contamination didn't occur on our end. We have all of these records here showing that we monitored all the correct temperatures, so it must have occurred somewhere else. Then you aren't liable any longer. Step 7 is institute verification procedures. Just making sure that the process that you have in place doesn't need to be revised in any way. So do you add another piece of equipment? Does that mean you have to add another critical control point? If you add another critical control point, then you have to set more critical limits and make sure that you're record keeping. So just making sure that the system is always the best that it can be. The role of the consumer. Most cases of foodborne illness are caused by foods prepared at home. There are steps that you can take to minimize your risk of foodborne illness. This includes carefully handling, storing, and preparing foods, and reporting any incidents involving unsanitary, unsafe, deceptive, or mislabeled food to the appropriate agency. Okay, so how do you report? Table 13.2 in your text gives you a specific breakdown of how to report any food-related issue. This can be problems related to meat and poultry. These are specifically reported to the FDA. Issues related to meat and poultry can also be sent to your state Department of Agriculture, who will then send those on to the USDA meat and poultry hotline. Restaurant food and sanitation problems should be reported directly to your local or state health department. Issues related to alcoholic beverages should be reported to the U.S. Department of the Treasury's Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Pesticide, air, and water pollution is reported to the EPA. And products purchased at the grocery store should be returned to the grocery store with you notifying the individual at the customer service desk about any issues that you experienced with that product. Pathogens in food. So some more definitions here, and it's important to get these two straight in your head because they are very different. So first we have foodborne infection. Foodborne infection is caused by pathogens that multiply in the human body. Somebody typically gets a foodborne infection from consumption of a large number of pathogens that then cause infection or produce toxins in your body, okay? Excuse me. In contrast, foodborne intoxication is caused by consuming food containing toxins produced by pathogens. It can be caused by food containing only a few pathogens if those pathogens have produced enough toxin. So the difference here is infection is when you're consuming that pathogen and it's producing the toxin in your body, whereas foodborne intoxication, the pathogen has already created a toxin on the food and then you're directly ingesting that toxin, right? Bacteria in food. We see bacteria everywhere. It's in the soil, it's on our hands, most surfaces in our homes, and on our food. Most bacteria are completely harmless. Some are actually really beneficial, but there are a few that are pathogenic or can cause disease. Salmonella bacteria is the most common cause of U.S. foodborne illness. Common sources of salmonella include poultry and eggs, contaminated meat, dairy products, seafood, fresh produce, and cereal. Prevention of salmonella. Salmonella is killed by heat, so it's important to thoroughly cook foods that are likely to be contaminated. Another bacteria, Campylobacter jejuni, it's the leading cause of acute bacterial diarrhea in developed countries. Common sources include undercooked chicken, unpasteurized milk, and untreated water. Prevention of Campylobacter jejuni includes heat. So this is a bacteria that grows slowly in cold temperatures and is killed by heat. So proper storage and cooking of foods is very important to preventing contamination. Escherichia coli or E. coli bacteria causes, some strains are harmful, but others can cause serious foodborne infection. One strain in water contaminated by human or animal feces has been known to cause what's called traveler's diarrhea. So it's called this because it's typically seen in maybe contaminated water sources in other countries. So you might have heard a warning if you're traveling internationally in some places. It's really not safe to drink the water. This would be one reason why. So different strains of E. coli. This one in particular, E. coli 0157H7, produces a toxin causing abdominal pain, bloody diarrhea, and fatal kidney failure. Common sources of E. coli include fecal contamination of water or food, for example, meats and produce. So while E. coli is a fecal contaminant and certain strains of it are very, very harmful, E. coli is also a naturally occurring bacteria in the soil that we eat. So a lot of produce, even if you grow your own fruits and vegetables in your garden at home, likely have some E. coli on them simply because they're coming from the soil. It's important to always wash your fruits and vegetables, but also certainly understand that not all strains of E. coli are dangerous. Listeria monocytogenes bacteria causes flu-like symptoms, which are more serious in high-risk groups, such as pregnant women, children, the elderly, and those with compromised immunity. During pregnancy, it can cause spontaneous abortion and stillbirth, fetal meningitis, and blood infections. Common sources everywhere. Listeria is just about everywhere in our environment. It survives and grows at refrigerator temperatures, so it often infects ready-to-eat foods. It's also a particular issue in hot dogs and lunch meat, which should be heated to a steaming point, and unpasteurized dairy products should be avoided. This is one reason why pregnant women are encouraged to avoid eating hot dogs, lunch meat, sausages, things like that, because of the risk of listeria. Vibrio vulnificus bacteria causes gastrointestinal upset, but can be deadly in people with compromised immune systems. Common sources: it grows in warm seawater and can be found in raw or undercooked shellfish, particularly oysters. How bacteria contaminate our food. So just some places where, again, some photos of where bacteria can make it into our food supply. Staphylococcus aureus causes bacterial foodborne intoxication. The toxin causes vomiting soon after ingestion. Common sources: Staph aureus lives in human nasal passages and is transferred to food through coughing or sneezing, and then grows on the food and produces a toxin. So here's a great example of a bacteria that normally wouldn't cause you any issue at all, right? So it lives in human nasal passages. It's really not a huge deal, but it does not belong in your digestive system. And so, or I'm sorry, once Staph aureus is on a food product, that's when it begins to produce a toxin. And once that toxin is produced on the food, if you ingest it, then that toxin is what makes you sick. Clostridium perfringens bacteria causes foodborne infection and intoxication. Common sources: little oxygen gets to the center of large containers, providing growth environment for these bacteria that thrive in low oxygen environments. They form heat-resistant spores in the stage of bacterial life, remaining dormant until environmental conditions favor growth. Clostridium botulinum causes blocked nerve function, resulting in vomiting, abdominal pain, double vision, and paralysis, leading to respiratory failure and death. And it is the deadliest of all bacterial food toxins. Common sources: it's in soil, water, and the intestinal tracts of animals. Toxin is produced when heat-resistant spores grow in low oxygen, low acid conditions. And it's commonly found, well, not common, but when Clostridium botulinum is found, it's typically in improperly canned foods, in foods held in large containers. This is one reason why it's very, very important, if you're somebody that likes to do home canning, that you follow instructions very, very carefully. There have been incidences here in Maine of folks becoming infected with botulism from improperly home canned foods. Because botulism can cause blocked nerve function and all of the issues listed above, one thing that can happen is a descending rapid paralysis in your body, which would eventually lead to death. And here's another reminder about botulism and its relation to improperly canned foods. Infant botulism is actually the most common form of botulism in the United States, which is caused by an infant ingesting botulism spores. These spores germinate in the infant's gastrointestinal tract, producing the toxin. In adults, we do see that because adults have a more developed GI tract, we have the intestinal microflora or bacteria that actually prevents some of those botulism spores from germinating. Some toxin is absorbed into the bloodstream, causing weakness, paralysis, and respiratory problems, though we do see infant botulism. Typically, those infants are able to recover. Botulism is one reason why you maybe have heard the recommendation to never feed honey to infants under 1 year of age. And the concern there is botulism infecting the infant from the honey. So we just talked about a whole host of bacteria. Now we're going to chat a little bit about viruses. Viruses are not classified as living or as cells since they cannot reproduce on their own. Human viruses reproduce only inside human cells. Viruses turn human cells into virus-producing factories. And viruses that cause human diseases actually cannot grow and reproduce in foods. First, we have noroviruses. These are a group of several different viruses and can cause about 50% of all U.S. foodborne gastroenteritis. So typically, if somebody has a stomach flu, the cause of that is going to be noroviruses. Common sources include eating food contaminated with the virus or touching a contaminated surface and then putting your fingers in your mouth. Shellfish can also be contaminated in water that's polluted with feces. The way to prevent norovirus contamination is through cooking, as they are destroyed with high heat. Hepatitis A causes liver inflammation, jaundice, fever, nausea, fatigue, and abdominal pain. It can require months of recovery but does not require treatment nor cause permanent liver damage. Common sources of Hep A include food or water contaminated with feces. So this is something, as simple as food service personnel washing their hands after using the bathroom before going back to preparing food. Not washing their hands could result in hepatitis A contamination of the food they're preparing. Prevention, chlorination of drinking water, cooking food, good sanitation, and vaccination. Mold and fungus. Many types grow on foods such as bread, cheese, and fruit. Under certain conditions, mold produces toxins, and there are over 250 different mold toxins. Cooking and freezing does stop mold growth, but it does not destroy toxins already produced. If a food is moldy, discard it, clean the area where it was stored, and check neighboring foods to see if they're contaminated. Excuse me. So, if you, check your cupboard and find a loaf of bread that maybe has mold on one end, it is not safe to take off the moldy slices and eat the remainders. Even though there isn't visible mold, the mold on any of the slices is producing a mold toxin within that bag or within that container, and those toxins are contaminating the rest of the product, even if there isn't visible mold there. So I like to say, when in doubt, throw it out. Parasites. Parasites are organisms that live at the expense of others. Some are microscopic, single-celled animals, and others are worms large enough to be seen with the naked eye. Prevention of parasites includes killing by thorough cooking. If raw fish is consumed, parasitic infections can be avoided by eating fish that has been frozen. Single-celled parasites include Giardia lamblia. Common sources of Giardia include drinking untreated water from streams contaminated with animal feces, in daycare centers where diapers are changed and hands and surfaces are not thoroughly washed. Also, Cryptosporidium parvum. Sources of Cryptosporidium include contaminated water and raw fruits and vegetables. Multicellular parasites include Trichinella spiralis. Once ingested, these small worm-like organisms find their way into muscles where they grow, causing flu-like symptoms. Common sources of Trichinella include raw and undercooked pork and game meats. Fish are also a common source of parasites because they can carry the larvae of roundworms, flatworms, flukes, and tapeworms. And then this photo is a picture of herring worm. So herring is a type of fish, and so in this instance, somebody caught some herring, maybe to eat, but they cut it open and found all of these worms living inside. So again, it's important to make sure if you are consuming fish, particularly raw fish, maybe some sushi. I know I really like sushi. Make sure that you're getting it from some place that you trust, whether that's from a fisherman, a direct fish supplier, or from a restaurant whose sanitation practices you trust. Prions. Now, Prions are something that you've probably heard of, but you don't know that you've heard of it. So prions are a pathogenic protein that causes degenerative brain diseases such as spongiform encephalopathies, which is short for a proteinaceous infectious particle. So you're probably listening to this and you're like, I've never heard of any of those words, like ever. But prions aren't an organism like a bacteria, and they're not a virus. They're a protein. But the reason why I say that you've probably heard of them is because prions are what causes mad cow disease, otherwise known as bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or BSE. It's a deadly neurodegenerative disease in cattle. So mad cow disease is actually caused by a prion, is caused by that protein. Now, mad cow disease can infect humans, but when we see mad cow disease in humans, it's referred to as Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which, as you can see here, is the human form of bovine spongiform encephalopathy. Causes include eating brain, nervous tissues, intestines, eyes, or tonsils from a cow infected with BSE. Meat and milk have not been found to transmit prions. And so you might be thinking, well, I really don't eat cow brain or cow eyes or intestines. I mean, some people do, right? But even if you don't, the meat and the milk doesn't transmit prions, but the issue can occur when you have a meat product and the producer has actually mixed in, or maybe has some cross-contamination of the meat with some of those other products. Symptoms of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in humans include mood swings and numbness, progressing to dementia and death. Preventing the U.S. cattle from contracting BSE because cooking does not destroy prions. I don't think we've had an outbreak lately, but I know I have heard of some here in the U.S. in the past. Table 13.3, I'm not going to go through this in depth, but it's a quick summary of bacterial, viral, and parasitic foodborne infections. It's a good summary of the information that we've talked about so far. If you kind of want to look through it, it's a good way to compare each of the different bacteria and other microbes that we discussed. So how to prevent microbial foodborne illnesses. Choose food carefully. As I said, when in doubt, throw it out. Prepare food in a clean kitchen to reduce cross-contamination, which is transfer of a microbe from one food to another. Store food properly in a refrigerator or freezer. Food served cold should be kept cold until served. Thaw frozen foods in a refrigerator or microwave and not at room temperature. So don't just throw a package of frozen chicken on the counter and let it sit there. Bad idea. Also, heat foods to recommended temperatures. Cooked foods should be kept hot until served. It's not enough to just heat up a food and then let it sit and come back to room temperature, because that's when those microbes are going to grow. A hot food should be kept hot until it is served for consumption. Safe grocery choices. This is table 13.4 in your text. It's important to purchase food from reputable vendors. Select jars that are securely closed, avoiding broken seals or cans that are rusted or dented. Not purchasing food unless the packaging is secure. Selecting frozen foods from below the frost line in the freezer. Choose foods that are solidly frozen, and check voluntary freshness dates and avoid foods with expired dates. Now, this is where things get kind of confusing. If you look at expiration dates, you know that there's a sell-by or pull-by date sometimes. That just means that that's the date that the supermarket should have the product off the shelves by. It doesn't mean that the product is bad. In fact, the product is still safe for consumption following a sell-by or pull-by date. Sometimes it will say best if used by. Best if used by simply means that you should use the food by that date to retain maximum freshness, flavor, or texture. Beyond a best by date, the product's quality may diminish, but the food may still be safe if it's handled or stored properly. So a good example is cereal. Cereal has a best by date, and you might have a box of cereal in your cupboard that's been in there a while. The best by date has passed, and you try it, and it kind of tastes a little stale, but you're starving, so you'll eat it. It's not going to kill you. It's not bad for you. It's not moldy. It just maybe has lost some of that flavor. And last, the expiration date. This is specifically the last day on which your product should be eaten. And some of this can be extended. If you have like a lot of meats and things have a freeze by date. So if you freeze them, then you're able to kind of extend that expiration date a little bit for the product. Safe handling of cooked foods. Cross-contamination, we've mentioned that a lot already. It occurs when uncooked foods contact cooked or raw foods. Cooked meat should never be returned to the same dish that held raw meat. Sauces used to marinate uncooked foods should never be used as a sauce on that food once it's cooked. So if you have chicken in a freezer bag with marinade and it's been sitting there for a while, and you take that raw chicken out and cook it, you take that cooked chicken, put it on your plate, and throw that marinade back on, you've just contaminated it with all of the bacteria from the raw chicken. So do not do that. Refrigerate cooked food as soon as possible. Large portions of food should be divided into smaller containers so that they'll cool quicker, and most leftovers should only be kept for a few days. Agricultural and industrial chemicals in food. Chemical contaminants in food. Chemicals used in agricultural production and industrial waste contaminate the environment and can find their way into the food supply. Quick definition here, we have bioaccumulation, which is when contaminated plants or small animals are consumed by larger animals, then eaten by even larger animals, reaching higher concentrations at each level of the food chain. So we see this here, right? In this diagram, we have groundwater, irrigation, waterways, lakes, oceans. These are maybe contaminated with agricultural chemicals and industrial wastes. The contaminated water then finds its way into plants that are growing nearby. Those plants are eaten by cows or another animal. So the cow eats lots of grass, so then there's a high concentration of contaminants in the cow, and then we eat the cow. So then that's how, even if you're not drinking water from a contaminated lake, that contaminated water can still find its way into your body. Same thing is true for water plants. Water plants will take in some of those toxins. Then a small marine animal, maybe a fish, maybe a shrimp, krill, something really small, gets those toxins from the plants. Then a smaller fish like sardine or herring will eat that shrimp or that krill and have a higher concentration in its body. Then a larger fish, maybe a tuna, will eat that sardine or that herring and have a larger concentration of the toxin. And then we eat the tuna, and as a result we end up again being contaminated with the chemicals that originated in the groundwater. Pesticides in food. Pesticides prevent plant diseases and insect infestations. They can be applied both before and after harvest. They produce higher yields and look more appealing from less insect damage, and are found on treated plants and in meat, poultry, fish, and dairy products. since they enter water, soil, and other parts of the environment. Depending on the risks of pesticide dependent on the size, age, and health of the consumer and on the type and amount consumed. Um, I know that insects can be, unsightly and unappetizing, but I know for me personally, I don't really care at all if I have, you know, small insects on my produce. So I grow a lot of food in my garden. Sometimes I'll, bring in a bunch of broccoli, and when I get it in the house and I'm cutting it up on the counter, I see like a little spider crawling away from the broccoli or something. It really doesn't bother me. And the reason why is I want to be eating food that bugs can eat. Um, because if bugs don't want to eat it, it's probably full of pesticides. So, as long as the insect isn't something that causes disease or, you know, negatively affects the food item that I'm eating, if a bug has chewed off a little corner of a piece of celery, I'll just cut off that piece of celery, but it's still perfectly good to eat. And quite frankly, if it's good enough for the bug, it's probably good enough for me too. Pesticide regulation. Types of pesticides, how often they're used, and the amount of residue that may remain when foods reach consumers are all regulated. The EPA approves and registers pesticides used in food production and establishes tolerances. Tolerances are the maximum amounts of pesticide residue that may remain in or on a food. Both the FDA and USDA are responsible for monitoring pesticide residues in food. Integrated pest management. I know there is a large, I can't think of the word, group, I guess. I can't think of the word right now. At the University of Maine that works in integrated pest management. A lot of times, particularly in spring or summer, they post jobs on the UMaine website. They're always looking for people to help with their integrated pest management programs. So if you've seen those, you might have wondered what they are. Agricultural pest control methods that combine chemical and non-chemical methods and emphasizes use of natural toxins and more effective pesticide application. It limits pesticide use and uses information about pest life cycles and their environmental interactions to manage pest damage economically and with least hazard to people, property, and the environment. Integrated pest management is something that I find very, very fascinating. For example, I had some, I can't remember what bugs they were, but some insects that were really destroying my vegetable gardens. And so I didn't want to use pesticides on the food that I was eating. So I went and bought some beneficial nematodes. And what the nematodes do is they are consumed by the harmful insects, and then those insects die. But the nematodes are not harmful to humans. They're a microscopic organism on their own. You just mix them with water and spray them on your plants, and they'll take care of certain insects. Another example of integrated pest management, I've had issues with cucumber beetles in the past. These are beetles that you see a lot on crops like cucumbers, zucchini, squash, and one thing that cucumber beetles don't like are nasturtiums. So nasturtiums are an edible flower that you can grow in your garden. So rather than use pesticides to control the cucumber beetles, because I don't want pesticides on my food, I'll grow a couple rows of nasturtiums bordering the cucumbers and the zucchini. that naturally repel the cucumber beetle. Plus, I get really nice flowers that I can add to salads because they're completely edible. So these are just a couple of examples. I know marigolds too can be planted near some foods to repel insects. All methods of controlling pests that don't involve using pesticides, which can be potentially harmful. Organic foods are produced, processed, and handled according to the USDA National Organic Program standards. Reduced chemical pesticides and fertilizer use is found in these foods. The USDA determines substances that can or cannot be used. Most conventional pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, sewage sludge, genetically modified ingredients, irradiation, antibiotics, and growth hormones are prohibited. It includes the recycling of resources and conservation of soil and water. The USDA has to certify a product before it can be labeled organic. So for labeling, if you see the term 100% organic, then that means that the product contains 100% organically produced raw or processed ingredients. If it just says organic, it has to contain at least 95% organically produced raw or processed ingredients. If it says made with organic ingredients, then it just has to contain at least 70% organic ingredients. So just something to keep in mind if you're reading labels of products while you're out shopping. We're going to talk about, this is a carcinogen, something that has been in the news lately, polychlorinated biphenyls or PCBs. They are a group of carcinogenic compounds. Prior to the 1970s, PCBs were found in runoff from manufacturing plants' contaminated water. They are still present in the environment and accumulate in fish from contaminated waters since PCBs do not degrade. Prenatal exposure in contaminated breast milk can cause nervous system damage and learning deficits. It's important to check with local health departments for recommendations regarding fish consumption during pregnancy and lactation. Other manufacturing contaminants include chlordane, which is used to control termites, can sometimes find its way into the soil or water. Some radioactive substances, cadmium, which interferes with mineral absorption and can cause kidney damage and impair brain development. Lead, arsenic, which increases cancer risk, and mercury, which can damage nerve cells and is more damaging during prenatal development. Antibiotics and hormones in animals are used to improve the health, increase growth, or otherwise enhance food production. To prevent antibiotics and hormones from being passed to consumers, types of drugs used and when they can be administered are regulated, and animal tissues are frequently monitored for drug residues. The pros of using antibiotics in animals that are treated with antibiotics when sick can have the disease prevented and promote growth within the animal. It increases meat production and reduces costs. The cons, of course, if it's used improperly, can leave antibiotic residues that can remain in the meat and can lead to the creation of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Hormones in animals can be used to increase weight gain in sheep and cattle and increase milk production in cows. Some hormones, such as estrogen and testosterone, occur naturally and generally administered in slow-release form, and levels are no higher in treated animals than in untreated animals. In order for a hormone to be used in an animal, it must be demonstrated that the synthetic hormone residues in meat are within safe limits. One example, bovine somatotropin, or BST, has created some public concern. You might have seen stuff about it in the news. It is produced naturally by cows and stimulates milk production. However, the hormone can be genetically engineered as a synthetic and is produced by bacteria and injected into cows to further increase milk production beyond what they would normally produce. Milk from cows that have been treated with genetically engineered BST is indistinguishable from other milk. However, a lot of milk producers make a point of saying if they don't use artificial growth hormones in their products. So you might have seen labels like this on milk or dairy products in the supermarket. And this just means that the company is not using any of that artificial bovine somatotropin in their milk production. Minimizing food contaminants. To minimize food contaminants, it's important to choose a wide variety of foods. If you only eat apples, or only eat apples from one local farm, if that local farm has any sort of contamination issues with apples, you're going to get a lot sicker than somebody who maybe has an apple some days and then an orange and then some grapes, because you're going to have a higher concentration of that contaminant in your body. Try to choose organic or locally grown produce when possible. Wash and in some cases peel produce. Just a few years ago, there was a contamination issue with cantaloupe. And what the issue was that there was bacteria, right, on the outside of the cantaloupe, on the outside of the melon. And not a huge problem, right? You don't eat the cantaloupe rinds, so it's not a big deal. It grows on the ground, so it picks up bacteria from the ground. But what was happening was people were not washing that exterior rind of the cantaloupe before cutting it. And the act of cutting the melon, the knife was taking bacteria from the outside rind that people don't eat and essentially, pushing that bacteria into the center of the melon and introducing that bacteria to the portion that people were eating. So it was causing a lot of people to get sick. So good reminder here to wash and in some cases peel produce, even if you're not going to be eating the outside. Trim fat from meat and remove poultry skin. Choose wisely and consume a variety of fish. Remove fish skin, fatty material, and dark meat. Broil, poach, boil, and bake fish. Excuse me, and avoid eating the lobster tamale or blue crab mustard. So again, these are all recommendations for how to minimize food contaminants. I'm not saying if you don't do these things, you're going to get a foodborne illness and die. But they're things to be mindful of if you are assessing the amount of risk that you're willing to take. Technology for keeping food safe. Food spoils when its taste, texture, or nutritional value is changed by natural food enzymes or by microbes that grow on food. Techniques that preserve food work by destroying enzymes present in the food, by killing microbes, or by slowing microbial growth. This table is from your text, table 13.5, the acronym FATTOM. You might have heard of it before, especially if you have worked in any type of food processing site. The acronym FATTOM is used to remind us of the conditions required for microbial growth. So first, F is for food, A is for acidity. Most bacteria grow best at a pH near neutral. So if food is very acidic, or if, say, you're pickling something, that acid can actually work to prevent microbial growth. First T is for time. The longer that a food sits at an optimal growth temperature, the more bacteria it'll contain. The second T is temperature. Bacteria and other pathogens like certain temperatures to be comfortable and grow. So if you cook a food at a really high temperature or freeze a food at a very low temperature, then that will work to inhibit microbial growth. The O is for oxygen. There are some pathogens that grow in the absence of oxygen, but for the most part, oxygen is necessary for bacteria to grow. So, food manufacturers have developed packaging that kind of sucks the air out of a food package to limit the amount of oxygen exposure, thus further reducing the bacterial growth. And the last M is moisture. Bacteria need water to grow. Drying, it has been very popular as a means of storing and preserving food for centuries. Back before we really had good refrigeration, you would read about, in the 1800s, how they would dry meat or heavily salt it because that salt is going to pull any extra moisture from the food. That allows it to be safe at room temperature longer. So you think about maybe beef jerky. You don't keep your beef jerky in the fridge because you don't have to. The absence of water in that product means that it can stay safe at room temperature. Food preservation, older methods, as I said, heating, cooling, drying, smoking, and adding substances like sugar or salt. Newer methods include irradiation, which we'll talk about more, and specialized packaging. The risk is, of course, that you can still have substances that enter the foods. Couple of quick definitions: the difference between additives and contaminants. Food additives are any substance that can be expected to become a part of the food. The FDA does regulate the type and amount of food additives. Then we have accidental contaminants, which are unexpected substances that enter the food, and these aren't regulated. And this could be anything from, a contaminant. Could be like a bacteria, or it could be maybe metal shavings that come off of machine equipment, so it's hard to predict if that will happen, but that's another reason why those HACCP guidelines are so important. High and low temperature preservation works to provide appealing and safe foods. Cooking kills microbes and destroys most toxins. Pasteurization is the process of heating food products to kill microbes. Sterilization and aseptic processing is the placement of sterilized food in sterilized packaging using a sterile process. And then refrigerating or freezing does not kill microbes, but it does slow or stop microbial growth. Carcinogens, so cancer-causing compounds that are developed by cooking meats. We have polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, which are formed when fat drips on a grill and burns, then rises with smoke and deposits on the food's surface. To limit exposure to these carcinogens, it's important to use lower fat meat and a layer of aluminum foil to prevent fat from dripping on the coals or the burners of a grill. Heterocyclic amines, or HCAs, are produced by the burning of substances in meat. In order to reduce your exposure to these carcinogens, pre-cooking meat, marinating meat before cooking, cooking at lower temperatures, reduce cooking time with smaller pieces of meat, and avoid overcooking. Acrylamide is formed by chemical reactions, during high temperature baking or frying, particularly in carbohydrate-rich foods. The highest levels are in French fries and snack chips, with smaller amounts in coffee and foods made from grains, like breakfast cereals and cookies. High doses of acrylamides can cause cancer, reproductive problems, and nervous system toxicity. Another method of food preservation is food irradiation, which is also known as cold pasteurization. It's used in more than 40 countries and used infrequently in the US because of public suspicion and lack of irradiation facilities. In food irradiation, food is exposed to high doses of X rays, gamma radiation, or high energy electrons to kill microbes and insects and inactivate enzymes that cause germination and ripening of fruits and vegetables. Pros and cons of food irradiation. It causes the addition of a food additive, produces compounds not present in the original food, so these are regulated, though opponents claim that it introduces carcinogens and allows the sale of previously contaminated foods. Food irradiation can decrease the nutrients present in foods, though irradiated food is not radioactive. Studies show that the benefits of food irradiation outweigh the potential risks, that it reduces the need for pesticides and other preservatives, and that it has potential for improving food safety. And this photo shows a picture of strawberries. The ones on the left have been treated with a process of irradiation, and you can tell that they are not spoiling, whereas the ones that were not treated with irradiation do show signs of spoilage. Food packaging keeps mold and bacteria out and keeps moisture in while protecting food from physical damage. Substances in paper and plastic containers, packaging, and dishes can leach into food. These are regulated by the EPA and FDA, and regulations apply only to the intended use of the product. For example, plastics can migrate into food when heated in a microwave oven, and only containers designed for microwave cooking should be used. Modified atmosphere packaging, or MAP, is a preservation technique to prolong shelf life of processed or fresh food by changing the gases surrounding food in the package. Uses packaging materials that are impermeable to gases. The air in the package is vacuumed out to remove oxygen. The product remains in a vacuum, or the package is infused with another gas. And the lack of oxygen in this packaging prevents aerobic bacteria growth, slows ripening and oxidation reactions, which cause fruit and vegetable discoloration and rancidity in fats. Food additives make food safer, maintain palatability and wholesomeness, improve color, flavor, texture, aid in processing, and enhance nutritional value. Direct food additives are substances that are added intentionally to foods, whereas indirect food additives are substances that get into food unintentionally. The FDA regulates the amounts and types of direct and indirect food additives in food. So a little bit more about that regulation. The manufacturer will submit a petition to use a new food additive describing chemical composition and how it is manufactured and detected in the food. The manufacturer must prove that the additive is effective for its intended purpose at proposed levels, that it's safe for its intended use, and that its use is necessary. Some additives are exempt from regulations. There are what are known as prior sanctioned substances. There are over 600 additives that were in use when the legislation was passed. These are also known as GRAs, or generally recognized as safe. These are additives considered safe based on the history of use in food prior to 1958 or on published scientific evidence. If new evidence suggesting additives in either category is unsafe, the FDA may require removal. For the further regulation of food additives, the additive can only be added at levels 100 times below the highest level shown to have no harmful effects. The Delaney Clause states that a substance that induces cancer in either animals or humans at any dosage may not be added to food. And the Delaney Clause can be found as part of the 1958 Food Additive Amendment. Sensitivities to additives. Some individuals are allergic or sensitive to certain food additives. Examples include monosodium glutamate, or MSG, can cause MSG symptom complex. In some texts, this is referred to as Chinese restaurant syndrome, just because Chinese food often uses MSG in their food production. If you go to a Chinese restaurant, oftentimes you'll see on the menu maybe a little blurb at the top or bottom that says food items may be prepared without MSG. And so either they'll say we don't use MSG, or they'll say we do, but if you're somebody that's sensitive to that, you can just request that your food be made without. So, it adds a lot of flavor, gives you sort of that umami sort of taste to food. But if it is an additive that you're sensitive to, restaurants are certainly accommodating in terms of leaving it out of foods. Sulfites are another example. They can cause symptoms ranging from a stomach ache and hives to severe asthma. And FD&C yellow number 5 is listed as that should say teratazine on medicine labels. It may cause itching and hives. So just something to look out for if you see that word or see yellow number 5 listed. Might be something that could cause a sensitivity. Color additives. Colors are classified as either certified or exempt. Certified colors are human-made, meet strict specifications for purity, and must be listed by name in the ingredient list. Exempt colors include pigments from natural sources, such as dehydrated beets and carotenoids. Carotenoids are some orange pigments that you might find in carrots or sweet potatoes. These may be listed collectively in the ingredient list as artificial color. And then this is table 13.6 from your text, and it's showing just a summary again of different types of additives and comparing some of the things we already discussed. Biotechnology, we're going to talk about genetically modified crops. So first you have a gene, which is part of DNA. We have DNA, animals do, plants do. And so in our bodies, we might have a gene for hair color or eye color. In plants, for example, they might have a gene for disease and drought resistance, say. And this gene can be transferred from plant, animal, or bacteria into plant cells. It creates a recombinant DNA, which is a combination of DNA from two organisms. Those modified cells then divide and differentiate into a new plant. That new plant is a transgenic organism, and each cell in the plant contains that transferred gene. And this is from your text, this graphic, and it's just showing you an example of the process of actually genetically modifying crops. Food applications of biotechnology, pros and cons. So GMOs, genetically modified foods, I think kind of get a bad rap. Genetically modified, to say a food is genetically modified and all genetic modification is bad, isn't really looking at the whole picture. So some genetic modifications are more problematic than others. So to dismiss all genetically modified foods as bad is really kind of missing the point, I guess. So biotechnology, including genetically engineering foods, can be used to alter quantity, quality, cost, safety, and shelf life. Making plants resistant to herbicides, insects, and various plant diseases increases crop yields and reduces damage from insects and plant diseases. Altering enzyme activity and other traits increases the shelf life of fresh fruits and vegetables and consumer appeal. For example, seedless grapes. So, if you've ever eaten a seedless grape or seedless watermelon, I mean, normally, in normal circumstances, right? Years and years ago, grapes had seeds. Some grapes still have seeds at the supermarket. Watermelons have seeds. Seedless varieties were made that way through genetic modification. And genetic modification, while it has been on the rise in recent years, and I'll show you a graph of that in a second, it's something that has been used for many, many years in the selecting of crops with desirable traits and then using those more desirable traits in other by crossing those plants with other plants. So for example, at some point there, maybe somebody was planting watermelons, and by just the luck or random mutation of a gene, one of those watermelons happened to be seedless. And the person was like, hey, this is really great, seedless watermelon, people are really going to love this. Then they started reproducing from that single watermelon and using that single watermelon's DNA that maybe was just mutated naturally to produce other species of watermelons that would definitely turn out seedless. So, genetically modifying foods isn't just, about pest resistance, kind of sound very dangerous and sci-fi. It actually can have a lot of benefits. Some food processing examples: enzymes in the production of cheese, high fructose corn syrup, and reduced lactose dairy products. Biotechnology, genetically modifying foods, can be very, very helpful for malnutrition. For protein deficiencies, some corn, soybeans, and sweet potato varieties have been modified to have enhanced essential amino acid levels. For vitamin A deficiency, this is a huge one. Genes for beta carotene synthesis enzymes were inserted into rice. So this was a technique that was used in a lot of Eastern nations, a lot of Asian nations that consume a lot of rice. So research was done to show that a lot of these populations were experiencing high rates of vitamin A deficiency. Now, vitamin A deficiency, if you remember from, I think it was chapter 6 or 7, vitamin A deficiency can lead to blindness. So it can be a really big problem. Well, in these countries, folks weren't, their diets didn't include a lot of high sources of vitamin A. Maybe those crops didn't grow well in their climates, or, maybe they just weren't preferred for whatever reason. So scientists looked at, okay, what do these cultures eat a lot of? And they found they eat a lot of rice. So in this instance, in order to combat the vitamin A deficiency, scientists were able to take the genes for beta carotene from carrots and splice that gene into the genes for the rice that was being grown and eaten there. And the result was what's known as golden rice. So I think there's actually a photo in your book, but it kind of shows a side-by-side of what looks like regular rice, just a white long grain rice, and then next to it is the same rice, but it looks kind of orangey in color, and that's the golden rice. So in this instance, we have genetic modification, which is taking the beta carotene gene from carrots, adding it to rice, so that people in nations that experience high levels of vitamin A deficiency are able to get the vitamin A that they need every day without drastically changing their diet. They still eat rice. That rice is just now a little orange and gives them the vitamin A that they need. So this is kind of what I'm talking about when I say that genetic modification isn't all bad. Some of it can certainly be problematic, but some of it can certainly be very beneficial. So to just flat out dismiss all genetically modified foods as being harmful, isn't really the right course of action. Biotechnology has also been used to address other nutrient deficiencies, like in cassava, which is a plant, modifying that to include increased zinc, iron, protein, and vitamin A levels. So certainly there are some concerns with biotechnology. In some instances, the nutrient content may be negatively affected. An allergen or toxin may be introduced. Genetically modified crops will be used to the exclusion of other varieties, reducing biodiversity, which may reduce the ability to adapt to new conditions, diseases, or other hazards. Some genetically modified crops can create super weeds. So again, like we talked about, drug-resistant bacteria, sort of the same idea. Genetically modified crops producing pesticides may promote the evolution of pesticide-resistant insects. So again, it's all about how the technology is used. So it's not the technology itself that's bad, it's how it's actually applied to the food. In the US, the most commonly genetically modified crops are soybeans, corn, cotton, and rapeseed or canola. Rapeseed oil is typically how you'd see that product processed. And foods that are likely, because those crops are the most common to be genetically modified, the foods that are most likely to contain genetically modified ingredients include those containing corn, high fructose corn syrup, soybeans, cottonseed oil, and canola oil. And as promised, here is that graph showing the y-axis here is acres of genetically modified crops in the millions. So you'll see down in 1996, just kind of a sliver in terms of acres of genetically modified crops and how much that has just boomed into 2012. This is because of several factors. So first, obviously, we are seeing higher rates of genetic modification in some crops, but also because of the crops that are being genetically modified. So back in 1996, we did have seedless watermelon, seedless grapes. We certainly were genetically modifying some foods, but grapes and watermelons don't make up a very large proportion of the crops that are produced. So now that we are seeing a lot of genetic modification in foods like corn and soybeans, and those products are covering a much larger percentage of food acreage in the country, just because you're including a food that is grown so much, we're going to see that rate increase. So part of it is more foods being genetically modified, but some of it is also the foods that are being genetically modified are those foods which are grown the most. Biotechnology regulation, the FDA, USDA, and EPA oversee plant biotechnology. Safety and environmental issues are monitored at all stages of the process. The FDA regulates safety and labeling of genetically modified foods. The USDA is responsible for regulating research and development of new agricultural products, and the EPA regulates pesticides that may be present in foods and sets pesticide tolerance levels. Last slide here. I know you've had a lot of information. Labeling of genetically modified foods. Foods are not required to have special labeling unless the nutritional composition has been altered. The food contains potentially harmful allergens or toxins, pesticides or herbicides, or new ingredients. Or it has been changed significantly enough so that its traditional name no longer applies. Pre-market approval is required if the new food contains a substance not commonly found in foods or without a history of safe use in foods. Recently, there have been a number of states, probably most notably California, that have been proposing the labeling of genetically modified foods. So it is something that is on the horizon, is on the minds of lawmakers and policymakers. But as a consumer, it's just important to remember that not all genetic modification is created equal or comes with the same level of risk. So thanks so much for listening in. I know it was a little lengthy, but I hope you learned a lot, and we'll chat later. Thanks so much.